This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 754 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Hey, thanks for tuning in. Remember to check out the Late Round Prospect Guide. The guide is a 135-page PDF that's filled with information about this year's running back and wide receiver draft classes. You get profiles for each player who went to the combine, a breakdown of my models, and so much more. You can order now over on lateround.com for just $14.99. And once you order, the guide gets delivered immediately to your email inbox. And once the draft is over, I'll be sending an updated guide with finalized prospect scores and new profile breakdowns. That'll happen just a day or two after the draft. And that comes with your $14.99 purchase. So go check it out over on lateround.com. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from @SkullActuary. It says, lately, third-round wide receivers haven't panned out. We have to go back to 2019 with Deontay Johnson and Terry McLaurin to find hits. Is this just noise, or is the NFL getting better at evaluating wide receivers? So with questions like this, it's always important to first see what the norm is, what the expectation is. Since 2011, if you look at players drafted after pick 64, so after round 2, and until pick 100, so roughly round 3, you get 49 wide receivers. Of those 49, 7 were able to give us a PPR point per game season of 15 or more during one of their first 3 seasons in the league. And 9 wide receivers gave us a 12-plus point per game season. If we focus on that 7 out of 49 number that hit 15 points per game, that means that since 2011, fewer than one third-round wide receiver per year is hitting a high-end wide receiver 2 season in one of his first 3 years in the league. That's just some rough math for you to get going with a baseline. Now, you mentioned that we haven't seen hits since 2019, and that's not wrong. No player in 2020, 2021, or 2022 has hit 15 PPR points per game. And every single one of the wide receivers have ended up being mediocre for the most part. I think Nico Collins and Josh Palmer might be the best players from the group. No one would consider them hits, or at least big hits. I also don't think there have just been bad prospects drafted in that range. De'Ami Brown was fine. David Bell was volatile, but he had upside. Bryan Edwards had a good analytical profile. There were some very obvious bad picks like Amari Rodgers and Velus Jones. But it seems like there's just been some bad variance there. Because it's really hard to look at an 11-player grouping that's being taken from a low-hit sample to begin with, right? Like 7 of 49 third-round wide receivers have been hits. Even if you want to raise that number to 9, that's 18% of your sample. 18% of 11 players over the last few years, that means we would have expected 2 of these guys to have hit. The fact that 0 of them have hit doesn't necessarily tell us that anything has changed with NFL evaluation. I think there's just a lot of noise and variance there. And keep in mind, a lot of these guys haven't even played 3 years in the league. So there's still some time for them to bounce back. I don't really anticipate any of them doing that, but you never know. But given historical hit rates in the 3rd round, I don't think this is anything that we need to focus on. Now, you should be caring a lot more about round 2 wide receivers than round 3 wide receivers, if that's not clear. Because the better the draft capital, the better hit rates you're going to see, especially when paired with a good profile. This next question is an email. It says, hey JJ, which matters more when evaluating rookies, early declare status or a player's actual age? And does early declare / age matter more for running backs or wide receivers? Thanks, Kyle from Houston. So I really think this sort of just goes back to what I talked about on episode 747 on taking metrics too far. Because no matter what I answer here, it's human nature to take it and run with it. To look at this in some sort of binary way. If I say that early declare status matters more than age, then people will ignore age and focus on early declare status. Or if I say age is more important, there's going to be more of a focus on age than early declare status. The truth is, though, everything works together. But I do think that breakout age matters more than raw age and early declare status. If I were to focus in on one age-related metric, breakout age would be that metric. And you can look at breakout age in a lot of different ways. But if you have some way to show the age of a player when he did really well in college, that's going to be valuable. Draft day age typically isn't that big of a deal when you're using it alongside other things. Though it is one of the inputs in my running back model. A lot of that is because it's rare for super old players to get drafted early. Just as an example, And then with early declare status, yes, it's better than not. You would rather have a wide receiver declare early than not declare early, but it's not everything. And I do worry about it more at wide receiver than I do running back. I just wanted to throw this one on the show this week because I don't think that this is necessarily how we should think about these things. Some metrics are undoubtedly better than others, but very rarely are you looking at metrics by themselves and only themselves. Or at least you shouldn't do that. You should want to build a story around a player by looking at their overall profile. And sometimes something like early declare status is going to matter a lot less if you have that context. Sometimes something like age is going to matter more. Depending on the player, depending on the situation, certain production metrics are going to matter more or less. That's just my honest answer. This next question is from @Stags2. It says, what's your outlook for TJ Hockenson this year? So earlier this offseason, I did a sell candidates episode. And on that episode, I talked about TJ Hockenson. It's really not that easy to talk about players like this because I don't think Hockenson is bad. My beef with him from a fantasy perspective is that I just don't see him maintaining his target share year over year. When he went to Minnesota, he didn't all of a sudden become a better player. His yards per route run numbers weren't dramatically different there. What was different was that he started seeing more volume in an offense that lacked alternatives. And it still, right now, today, does lack those alternatives. But Hockenson hit almost a 24% target share per game rate in relevant games for the Vikings last year. 24%. At tight end, that's not a normal number across multiple seasons from a non-elite tight end. And I call Hockenson non-elite because he's never had a yards per route run season like a Mark Andrews or a George Kittle. I mean, Kittle hasn't had below a 1.73 yards per route run rate since his rookie season. Hockenson's never been above 1.6. We've seen 27 tight end seasons with 8 or more games played and a target share per game rate above 23% since 2011. So this is essentially Hockenson on the Vikings. That may seem like a lot, but really, it's been done by just 13 tight ends. Travis Kelce has done it 5 times. Mark Andrews has done it 4 times. Darren Waller and George Kittle 3 times. Hockenson has not been that type of tight end historically. Each of those guys consistently gave us better yards per route run rates than TJ Hockenson has given us. Next on that list is Greg Olsen, who gave us 3 of those seasons. 3 seasons with a 23% target share per game rate. And that, to me, is probably the better comp for Hockenson, which isn't bad. Olsen was fine in that 2013 to 2015 range, but he wasn't winning you leagues the way a player like Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews wins leagues. Zach Ertz is another one who's similar to that. That's why this is really hard for me to talk through, because it's not that I'm saying that TJ Hockenson is bad or can't be useful in fantasy. I think that he's going to be useful. I think he can match ADP expectation. I just am always aiming for those elite guys at tight end. And at this moment in April, I don't know if he has that kind of ceiling because he hasn't been as good as the typical elite guys. He's more like a Zach Ertz or a Greg Olsen. And for those types of players to do very, very well in fantasy, they need super, super high target shares. More so than what a Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, or George Kittle needs. Honestly, it's pretty similar to how I viewed Dalton Schultz entering last season. It's just that Hockenson's a better player, so fading Schultz was a lot easier to do. And maybe this is all something that you're okay with. Totally fine. I probably won't completely fade TJ Hockenson. But I do think there's a lot of people out there who believe that he got substantially better in Minnesota. That's not really the case. He was fed more in a better environment for it, and that could keep up to some degree. But he wasn't some transformed and new tight end. And I know, I can already hear you saying this. I thought targets were a talent statistic. I thought they were earned. They are. Hockenson is going to see a solid target share floor because he's a talented player. But because he's not this uber efficient player per target or per route, he needs that volume to stick more than some other elite tight ends would. And it's going to be hard for that to happen. This next question is from @LWOS_Mike Cash. It says, can you rank these 3 prospects? Sean Tucker, Izzy Abanikanda, Dwayne McBride. Yeah, I think it's in that order. There are a lot of running backs who can bounce up and down after the draft depending on draft capital. Like a Sean Tucker or an Izzy or someone like Tank Bigsby. I really like all of those players. Tucker's someone who I think has a very wide range of outcomes. But that's a good thing when you're talking potential day 2 or early day 3 running backs. He's got one of the best production profiles in the class. He does compare favorably to collegiate productive busts like Jeremy McNichols, Eno Benjamin, but Dalvin Cook was a comp for him in my model too. And then with Izzy Abanikanda, one of his top comps in the prospect guide was and still is Isaiah Pacheco. He's got the size to handle a big workload, and he's got the size-speed combo that's not easy to find. He just doesn't have the best receiving profile in the world. And speaking of receiving profiles, that's why the model hates Dwayne McBride. McBride caught 5 passes in college. Across 3 years, he caught 5 balls. That's a problem. He had the 7th worst best season reception share of any prospect who was drafted or at the combine dating back to 2011. It's just really hard for me to buy into that. We know that backs who catch passes in college are not locks to do that at the next level. But we don't see receiving profiles like this translate very often at all. We actually haven't seen one this bad translate at all since 2011. Now, I could see McBride being an early down guy who maybe can be used as a goal line back. Definitely more of a best ball player than a managed league player. But I'm definitely worried about where the upside's going to come from. More so than the other 2 backs within this question. This next question is from Zach from Patreon. It says, how is Zay Flowers ranked with the 4th highest wide receiver score in your model, but has weak comps? Will comps help you decide where you ultimately rank a player? So in the prospect guide, each player page has information that includes their top 3 comparables. And those are based on the things that are in the model. So size, breakout age, best season yards per team pass attempt, and so on. Zay Flowers doesn't have the most attractive comps in the world. Zach is right. His top one was Phillip Dorsett, then it's Randall Cobb, and then it's Marcus Wheaton. I don't think his play style is necessarily captured there, but those are the objective comps that came back given the inputs that I just talked about. Now, this doesn't mean that he's bound to bust. One of those comps actually had a great career. All that means is that historically, we haven't seen a lot of great production come from players with Flowers' profile within the context of this model. We also have to keep in mind that those are just 3 players. You're not going to capture a player by looking at 3 comps. To me, the comps are there to just give you a general idea of the type of player that we're working with, and if we've seen that in the past. And in some cases, those comps are less of a match than others. I don't have that piece listed in the prospect guide, but Flowers comps are not as strong of matches as someone like Jalen Hyatt or Quentin Johnston. To me, comps are more about storytelling and helping people understand more about a player. They shouldn't be the focus of any analysis. And I can speak for myself and say that they shouldn't be the focus of my analysis. But they're interesting. When comps are strong, we can feel a little bit better about a prospect knowing that the same type of profile hit in the past. But Zay Flowers is kind of a unique player. I said as much in the prospect guide. The more unique a player is, the more difficult it's going to be to find perfect comps for him. But to give you an idea of how much I use comps to rank players, Flowers has mediocre comps. But he could easily be my wide receiver 3 post-draft. Right now, he's wide receiver 4. But there's a real chance he makes the jump depending on draft capital. The comp piece is just an added bonus as opposed to being a true part of my process. This last question is from @Mozamek. It says, all other inputs being equal, what impact does Chig Okonkwo's day 3 draft capital have in him potentially breaking out in your tight end model? So again, if this is your first episode of the podcast this offseason, you may not be aware that I've been working on a tight end model, finally. It's in a really good spot, too. You can read more about it in the newsletter archives over on lateround.com. The model actually isn't very tied to draft capital, at least in the same way as running back and wide receiver, which is a little bit surprising. But it's mostly because it's trying to capture and predict the elite tight ends, the real difference makers. And a lot of those players weren't drafted in round 1. The year 2 model for tight ends does use a player's prospect score, though. And a player's prospect score does still use draft capital. So naturally, Chig Okonkwo's year 2 score has some input of draft capital. I wouldn't say it's super dramatic, though. The impact of draft capital in the year 2 model, not super impactful. I don't really know how to answer the what impact does his day 3 draft capital have exactly, but I can tell you that if he would have balled out last year, like been absolutely amazing, his draft capital wouldn't have mattered at all. He's currently in the 89.6 percentile. So he's almost a 90th percentile player in that model, which is very good. Now keep in mind, this model isn't working off of a huge sample because there just aren't as many tight ends as there are wide receivers and running backs. It also goes back to 2015 and not 2011 because of available data. But of the 14 players who have been in the 88th percentile or higher in the model, there have been 3 day 3 picks. Those 3 are Chig, Alberto and George Kittle. Both Kittle and Alberto looked better as prospects than Chig did in the model. But it looks like things could go really, really well here, or they could really, really go south. But since it's tight end, I want to take a shot at the upside. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I greatly appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.